now to tonight's guest, Ted Reinstein. He's been a reporter for 20 years with WCVB Channel 5 in Boston. He's also a regular contributor for the station's Political Roundtable show, and he writes a weekly opinion column. He's now the author of 3 different books. Some of you might have seen Ted here when he was here to talk about Wicked Pissed, New England's famous feuds. And tonight he's talking about his new book, New England's General Stores, Exploring an American Classic. In the spirit of the general store, we have a penny candy display set up over the side. Please help yourself during or after the program. Ted will answer questions and sign and sell his books after he's done speaking. And please help me welcome Ted Reinstein.
Thank you very much, Libby. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the friends of the Middleborough Public Library. You know, I always say, good libraries cannot have enough good friends. And no, seriously, and it's not the case everywhere. Some libraries don't have friends organizations. I can tell just by seeing the turnout here that this is particularly not only a great library with a great staff, but obviously a really terrific friends group. So thank you. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that on behalf of public libraries, which are a passion of mine. So thank you very much. It speaks well for you to support the library. It speaks well for you to be here tonight. How many of you were at my last talk here about Wicked Piss? Oh, it's good. It's good. Not enough, but it's good.
So how you pissed?
No, not me. You know what I love tonight is that you talk about a creative, imaginative library group. So Libby and her staff had the idea of having penny candy here, which is actually not even a penny, it's free. Because you can't find penny candy anymore. The cheapest candy I found at over 75 general stores throughout New England was a quarter. Okay? So they've got great penny, and talk about retro. Check this out. They've got 3 of my all-time favorites. Bit of honey, sugar daddies, which I think allowed my dentist to do an addition to his house.
Yeah.
And waxed milk bottles. Right? They're all right over there. Now, Libby said, please help yourself either during or after. I'm going to amend that to just after. This isn't dinner theater, but something to look forward to. So tonight, I am going to talk to you about my most recent book, my 3rd book, New England's General Stores. You know, everybody who knows me at Chronicle, which I guess by now is everybody there, but know that in my travels all around New England, I'll be striking out again the next 2 weeks for traveling around New England. They know that there are 2 iconic New England institutions that I'm as passionate about as public libraries, and I can't pass by without stopping. One is a classic New England diner, right? If you know some of my travel pieces, you know that it pretty much always includes breakfast at a diner. So I noticed about 15 years ago, maybe a little more, that diners seem to be making something of a comeback. I don't know if I'd call it a comeback at first, now they have, well, as much as it occurred to me that they were not disappearing at the same pace they had been, right? And those that were going up for sale were frequently being successfully sold and continued as diners. Now, there were whole libraries full of books about diners, so we didn't need another book from me about diners, although I would have been more than happy to do the research. But it occurred to me about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, that the same phenomenon was occurring with general stores, which is my other pet New England iconic institution. But this interested me more in some ways, because, you know, if you like diners, how many of you like diners? How many of you have a favorite diner? You have a wonderful one here in Middleborough. Just there in August. So, you know, if you like diners and you want to stop at a diner on the road, you don't sort of deliberate like, well, let's see. Let's see what we find first, a diner or a fancy French restaurant. Right? It's not like that. If you like diners and you see a diner, then it calls to you like a beacon in the night. right? And you stop. General store is a different story. Anything you can buy in a general store, anything you can buy in a general store, you can buy somewhere else. Often cheaper. So why would general stores start making a comeback? Why would general stores suddenly seem to small towns that have them suddenly more important to them than ever? I really found myself fascinated with that. Because economically, demographically, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense why general stores would matter more now than ever before. When there's nothing in them, you can't buy at a brick and mortar or online cheaper. So at a certain point, you have to realize it's not about what a general store sells. It has nothing to do. The reason why general stores have made a comeback, the reason why general stores matter to some towns that have a general store, they matter to them more than ever before, has nothing to do with a single item that is on a shelf in one of those stores. It has to do with what a general store represents to a community. And that last word is the one that matters most, community. You know, if this was a drinking game, every time I said community, none of you would be able to drive home tonight, okay? Because that's really the operative word here tonight, is about community. So I'm going to start off with, little biology, zoology lesson. Oh, you didn't think there was going to be any work here tonight? Homework? So you are looking at an endangered species that was hunted to complete extinction. Gone. You will not find a dodo bird on the face of dear Mother Earth today, anywhere. Now, this is an example of a presently endangered species that is not yet fully extinct. And so is this. Now, when it comes to the type of predator that drove the dodo to extinction, there's a rendering of what that might have looked like. When it comes to the type of predator that has driven the general store, or seemed to be driving the general store to complete extinction, I'm going to tell you right now, none of our hands are clean. Right? Don't think like you're not part of this. I am. We all are. In fact, I may have consorted with one of these predators within the last 72 hours. Certainly within the last week.
Oh.
Right? None of our hands are clean. However, there's a reason why I chose these two very, very modern iterations of these two big box stores. In fact, in the case of Target, that's still a model, right? So it's not even brick and mortar yet. There's a reason why. Because the demise of the general store, the slide of the general store to what seemed at one point to be certain extinction, did not begin with the big box stores. In fact, when general stores first began their slide to obscurity, Sam Walton was still running things out of a single store in Missouri. That's how long ago that was. How long ago was that? 50 years ago. Half a century ago. So it wasn't the big box stores. You know, I like to turn to one of my favorite chroniclers of American popular culture. And something that he noticed half a century ago. Now here is John Steinbeck, pictured in Sag Harbor, New York, with his best friend, Charlie, right? I always wondered if Mrs. Steinbeck ever felt sort of like, do you have to refer to him as your best friend? How about your best four-legged friend? What am I, chopped liver? Do you know, I don't know, I've been rereading Travels with Charlie over the last few months, and you know, she actually met John at several points in his travels around. But she was wise enough to conclude that perhaps best left to Charlie to spend the night in the converted GMC pickup with the camper in the back, which Steinbeck called Rocinante. Anybody know what Rocinante referred to? Librarians are excluded because they know everything. You know what they say, right? If you want an answer, you can Google it. If you want the right answer, ask a librarian. Anybody else?
Don Quixote, isn't it?
Don Quixote, very good. Very good, yes. Rocinante was Don Quixote's horse. Okay? Leave it to Steinbeck to name a pickup truck after a literary reference. And in 1960-62, he and Charlie did circumnavigate America. And look what he noticed half a century ago. Look what he noticed half a century ago in his travels around America, that the big towns were getting bigger and the small stores were disappearing. Whatever kind of stores they were, including general stores, they were disappearing. He noticed that in 1962. So more than half a century ago, you know, when Steinbeck was growing up in Salinas, California, this scene would have been instantly recognizable to every single American. Every single American was, well, that's a general store. Now I'm not so sure. If you ask young people today, I'm sure they would obviously recognize that as some sort of retail thing from the past. But that was a general store. That was a general store to every American. In fact, what's really interesting is that this design starts in New England, and this is kind of fun. If you Google general stores in America, you will see, what's fascinating is, you'll see all kinds of exterior architecture that echoes the geography of where that store is. For instance, some of my favorites are in the Southwest, where you've got these adobe general stores, right? But the interior almost unfailingly copies the original design of every New England general store, which was just that, with a big wood stove in the middle, kind of a big U-shape. It's really kind of uncanny. But this was what Steinbeck grew up, right? But if you go 50 years out from there, then you have 1950 and kind of the pivot moment for general stores. Many things, not just general stores. It changed American life in almost every single conceivable way. And a simple three-word, the car. The car. This is 1950, and for the very first time, a majority of Americans own an automobile. And that changed, you talk about game changing. That changed everything. It changed American relationships with each other. It changed our relationship with work. It changed our relationship with the way we did commerce. It changed everything. And it changed everything for general stores. Because if you go 20 years out from that, you have the mushrooming of the interstate highway system. And what that meant was now that if you lived in a small town and this was the sort of choice you had at your small little local store, and all you had to do was jump into the car that's now parked in your driveway and go maybe an exit or two on the interstate and get to this, it makes it kind of tough if you're dealing with this, competing with this, right? But a funny thing happened on the way to extinction. And that is kind of the central irony of what I want to share with you tonight, because it's why, it was the moment that I finally decided I wanted to write this book, was this irony. Because what it turns out is, the same factors that seem poised to completely obliterate the general store become the same factors in the end that save them. How is that? That's what we're going to talk about. So, when you get to the late 60s, early 70s, again, all because of the car. Because of the car. Really, basically. People could live wherever they want. They could take a job wherever they want. It changed everything. And you have the rise of what I call the super suburbs. So in metropolitan areas, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Burlington, Portland, you name it, you have the rise of these super suburban communities. And now you have baby boomers who are starting families of their own. They're able to afford, because of a good economy and so forth, they have houses that their parents could only have dreamed about. They have amenities in these suburban communities, sometimes great school systems, great athletic programs, community recreational programs. You go off to work in the morning, you drive by X number of small strip malls, and you have your choice of umpteen different kinds of coffee. Whatever you want, life is perfect. Or is it? You know, it turns out that a lot of folks in these super suburban communities, oddly enough, were missing something. Even though many of them didn't or couldn't put their finger on it at the time. But they were missing something. And another big store-sized irony, it turns out to be community. So it turns out you can live within 20 feet of your neighbor on both sides, every side, and yet not necessarily feel grounded in a community. It turns out the community is not defined by the mass of people that share the same place. That doesn't make a community. We didn't know that at this point in time. But you know who did? This wonderful man, sociologist named Ray Oldenburg. And you're going to wonder, why would I be going off on this kind of tangent? Thank you. Why would I be going off on this kind of tangent? Because it has everything to do also with why general stores still exist today. So Ray Oldenburg is this wonderful American sociologist who I think does not get nearly enough credit. He spent the 70s, the early 80s, researching something he was fascinated by. And he was the first academic to devote really his career to this subject, and that was, what does it mean to be a community in America? Why do communities matter? Do they matter to Americans? No one had ever spent their career sort of grappling with that subject, but Ray Oldenburg did. And he came up with a theory that he called the third place. And what he found was that we as Americans, despite the fact that we think of ourselves as being free as a bird, we travel wherever we want, we do what we want, God damn it, nonetheless, he found we still spend the vast majority of our lives in one of just three places. The first place you can probably guess, home, family. The second place you can probably also guess, work, whether we like it or not. The third place is where it gets interesting. So the third place in American life, Ray Oldenburg found, is not one particular place. It can be one of many different kinds of places, but they all have something vital in common. Third place can be a house of worship. It can be a place where you go and get your hair done, barbershop, beauty shop. It can be a public library. God bless them and keep them. It could be a neighborhood bar where you meet up from friends of your community who really do know your name, right? It could be a general store. It could be a diner. The thing is about a third place in American life is that when you go to these third places, you may be going to do, right, a discrete assigned task, right? Return a book, get your hair done, get a drink, get a quart of milk. But there's also the unconscious expectation, or conscious, that you will also be interacting with people from your community. And what Ray Oldenburg found was, this is not just like a pleasant little add-on. It's something that we actually need. It's something we need. Like sunlight, like oxygen. And they were disappearing in American life at this time, in the 70s. They were beginning to disappear. And what he found was, they may go away, but we don't need them any less. And when his book came out in 1989, it was revelatory. And it has been ever since, this concept of the third place in American life. So, you get to a point in the late 70s in these super suburban communities, because by now you're probably wondering, how does this tie into general stores? So, you get to a point in the 70s when the boomers are beginning to have families of their own. And a lot of them are missing this sense of community that is not part of these big metropolitan suburban communities. And as they're starting to have kids of their own, a lot of them felt like, you know what? I would like to have more of a sense of community like I had growing up than my kids seem to be having here. And a lot of them struck out for small towns around New England to find this sense of community. And they did. They did. They did. They found it in places like Barnard, Vermont, which is not at all alone in that. They found them in many other places, many of which I'm going to share with you tonight. But Barnard is a perfect example because there they found that this thriving third place, as exemplified by its general store, had never disappeared. It had never stopped being a vital community gathering place. It was still the same community gathering place that it was in 1945, in 1985, in 2005. It had never stopped. So a lot of these folks bought general stores, right? And they felt like, this is great. This is what I'm talking about. This is why we moved here. And this was great for about 20 years. By the time you get to about 2000, a lot of these folks, particularly those who had bought a general store, you know, they get to a point in their life where they're getting up in age, they feel like, you know what, this was great, and now maybe we'll sell the store, take some time off. Maybe somebody else would like to keep the store going. And then, in the late 90s, 2000, the economy craters. And they're not successfully selling general stores, and a wave of general stores all over New England, hundreds, over about a 5-6 year period, go under. And now, it really does look like perhaps this is the glide path to the sunset of the general store. And I think it would have been. I think it would have been had it not been for one extraordinary small town in New Hampshire. You know, you may never have heard of South Ackworth, New Hampshire. It's one of the hidden towns, I call it, some of the hidden hill towns in kind of west central New Hampshire. You think of Keene, right? You go up Peterborough, go north, maybe northwest a tiny little bit from there. You get to like Marlow, Westmoreland, South Ackworth. And in South Ackworth, they had a wonderful general store, but it was going to take a village. It was going to take a village to save this store, and it did. If they had not successfully done this, I think it may be that a lot of stores, I always say as much as 50%, would have closed in the wake of the next 25 years. So South Ackworth, there had been a village store for over 100 years. Now, that's true of all the stores in the book. Every store in this book has been around for at least 100 years, 3/4 of them for twice that long, for over 200 years. They have all occupied the same physical footprint for all of that time, except one, which we'll get to at the very end. And they have all been, for all of that time, always been a general store. So the same was true in South Ackworth. But in 1999, 2000, the owners of the South Ackworth Village store, who had owned the store for 37 years, way beyond the average ownership of a general store, they decided to retire. They needed to retire, put the store up for sale. Nobody is interested or can buy the store. The economy is lousy, and a year later, in 2001, you have 9/11, and in the wake of 9/11, tourism in some places around New England is off almost 90%. You may recall people were just not traveling. This was killer for general stores. Many other things as well, but many of these general stores depend vitally on tourism traffic, at least for 2 or 3 seasons of the year, and that was gone. And they tried to sell the store. The store languished on the market for about 2 years, and then it closed for good. Lights out. And the little town of South Ackworth, New Hampshire, had to reconcile with the fact that their single community gathering place was gone. What to do? Well, the economy wasn't such that any one person seemed to be able to come forward and buy the store. So after 2.5 years, they kind of came together as a group, and they said, you know what? What if we try to do collectively what we've been unable to do individually? Right? Sounds very socialistic, right? Sometimes that works. And it did. And it did. They came together, they formed a co-op. You know how that works? Just like a food co-op, right? You put in X number of hours per week as a family, you get X amount of discount on your groceries, and it worked. Everybody went to work, putting in a few hours a week in the store. They made a pizza oven after 2 years to bring in more money. They formed these harvest dinners that today get visiting chefs from all over New England. And today, the South Ackworth Village store is thriving like never before. I hope the lights don't go out there anytime soon. This created a model for other general stores to point to and say, look, we also haven't been able to find a single person to buy the store, but look at South Ackworth, New Hampshire. It worked for them to create collectively by the store. And it was able to be replicated, thus saving a whole wave of additional general stores. One of my favorite stories involves the little town of Shrewsbury, Vermont, where they not only had to deal with a bum economy, they had to deal with Mother Nature. Let me explain. So when this picture was taken, Marjorie Pierce right here was in her early 70s. And at this point, the Pierces have been the proud owners and have operated Pierce's Village store for almost 75 years. And it is the heart and soul of Shrewsbury, Vermont. It is the heart of downtown. Shrewsbury, Vermont. There is downtown Shrewsbury, Vermont. At rush hour. That's why there's two people there. Okay? Yeah. All right? So, but the thing is, if you're doing the math at home, in 20 more years, Marjorie Pierce was in her early 90s. And at that point, the poor woman wanted nothing more than to take a little time off. Who could blame her, right? She can't stand on her feet all day at the store. Problem is, if Marjorie Pierce takes even a day off, there's nobody to run the store. That's a problem. Nonetheless, she can't do it anymore. Woman's 94 years old, and she can't stand on her feet anymore, and she tries to sell the store, can't sell the store closes. And Shrewsbury, Vermont goes through the same period of angst and heartbreak and loss that South Ackworth, New Hampshire did. What to do? What to do? Well, Marjorie Pierce, for one, felt terrible. She felt terrible. She couldn't reopen the store, but she did call a friend of hers, who happens to be one of my very favorite New Englanders of all time, Paul Brune. Paul Brune is a visionary person in New England. He is the founder and creator of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. And what the Preservation Trust does, they started doing what they do in Vermont. Today they do it all over America. And what they do, they help cities and towns hold on to their history. They don't do it out of an overdeveloped sense of nostalgia or sentimentality. They do it out of a very hard-edged sense of economics. Because what they have found is cities and towns that hold on to their history. By history, that could mean a historic Main Street and shopping district, right? It could mean a historic theater. It could mean a library. It could mean a diner. It could mean a general store. But it could mean a mill complex, right? They have found that when they hold on to their history, they have a better chance of economic sustainability going forward than if they get rid of the history. In other words, tear them down, pave them over, and then wait and put in the hands of God a developer coming along. Developers, just like if you go to see a house, think of it this way. If you're looking for a house, your realtor takes you to a vacant lot. Says, couldn't you see living here? Maybe. But I'll tell you what, I see myself living in that beautiful house I saw yesterday that had kind of the backyard that I like, and the deck, and the jacuzzi, right? So when you can see, that's what developers want. The Preservation Trust realized that 45 years ago. All right, long story. Marjorie Pierce didn't call up Paul Brune to talk about that. She called up Paul Brune and she said, Paul, I need to talk to you. Well, Paul, being the good friend that he is and the good man that he is, he jumped in his beat-up Prius and he drove down from Burlington. Because what else would you be driving from Burlington? Yes, he wears Birkenstocks too. He actually does. Lovely man. I love Paul Brune. So he drove down and she said, Paul, I need to reopen the store. He said, Marjorie, dear, how are you going to do that? She said, I'm not going to do it, you are. He said, what? I'm going to give you the store, Ninny. And I'm going to give you $10,000, which is pretty much all the money I have, but I don't expect to need it too much. Moa. Well, Paul tried to explain to Marjorie Pierce that this is not what the Preservation Trust does. It's exactly what they don't do. They don't go in and buy property. They're not set up for that. It's not in their mission statement. It's not part of their philosophy. He tried to explain to her, Marjorie, dear, it's not what we do. We help cities and towns take ownership of their own properties, invest in their own property. We help them write grants. We help them find funding. We help them raise money. But we don't own property outright, not a single one. And she said, piffle. Well, they went back and forth, I think, for about 15 minutes. But long story short, within about 30 minutes, Paul was back in his beat-up Prius, making his way back up to Burlington. And the Preservation Trust, lo and behold, owned its first piece of property outright. As Paul puts it, you try saying no to Marjorie Pierce, okay? But he did come back down to Shrewsbury a week and a half later, and he met with the local historical society because he had told them, I need to talk to you about the store. So he got there and he said, listen, it's true, I hold the deed to the store. but I am not going to be running the store. You're not going to see me here once the store reopens. They said, well, how's that going to work? He said, you folks are going to run the store. And they were all like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Oh, whoa, whoa. They were like, we're craftspeople, okay? I make macrame. We're artisans. We're farmers. We're not business people. He said, don't worry about it. I've heard this before. You're going to be business people in a couple of years. We're going to have lots of homework. We're going to do lots of field trips. And they did. And they did. They learned how to outfit a general store. They learned how to do inventory. They learned how to order inventory. They learned how to completely renovate the interior of a 200-year-old general store, and I think they did a damn fine job. And it looks exactly like that. I sat in the red chair last November, and I'm not saying it went off without any hitch at all. Right before they reopened the store, they went to the town, and they asked for another $1,500. This is a town of under 800 people that had already raised $65,000. That's a lot of money, right? Right. So people were not thrilled to hear this, but they said, listen, the store's never had an emergency generator. We need an emergency generator. If we are going to be a true community gathering place, through thick and thin, and the worst bit of Vermont what you can throw at us, the town needs to know we'll be here and we can turn the lights on no matter what. And there was a lot of grousing. Marjorie Pierce never needed it. But they got the emergency generator. They reopened in 2009, and the beating heart of little Shrewsbury, Vermont, there at also rush hour, I believe, was beating once again for 2 years. Because 2 years later, in August 2011, the worst natural disaster to ever hit the small state of Vermont when Hurricane Irene barreled up along the East Coast. It had been technically downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it reached Vermont, which never sees a hurricane, much less a tropical storm of this size. But you know, whether you're packing the 75-mile-an-hour winds of an official hurricane or the 67-mile-an-hour winds of a tropical storm, doesn't matter, right? You're still going to blow away 200-year-old covered bridges. And it did all over Vermont. And all over Vermont the first day that Irene hit, the lights went out, power went out, all over Vermont, including little Shrewsbury, Vermont, except one little
Because of the generator.
4:45, the afternoon of Irene, and at Pierce's, that intrepid crew trooped over through the howling wind and the flying debris and the pouring rain. They fired up that emergency generator, the lights came on, and to hear Sally Deinzer tell it, who runs the store today, she said, you know, about 5 o'clock, it looked like something out of Night of the Living Dead. Because she said, we'd look out that window, the big plate glass windows, and down the street, down the hill, all we saw were people coming out of the woods. And they were seeking out the light. And they got to Pierce's, and the lights were on, and the coffee was hot, and the Wi-Fi was working, and people were able to contact relatives, tell them everything is okay. And maybe you won't be surprised to find out, nobody's ever complained about that emergency generator ever again. Now, okay, so far, we've reached the pivot point in our story. So we've reached the point now in the 2000s where the economy has improved. So we've gone through the apocalyptic phase, where it looked like general stores might actually completely disappear. And now the economy has improved. So those stores that are doing okay are able to maintain. And some stores that did go up for sale were now able to be bought. There were some individuals who could come forward with an improving economy and save the store single-handedly, right? You know, in a chapter I call Honey, I Bought the Store, I love to point out that my friend Larry Beerfield and his lovely wife Robin, ex-owners, they just sold Fern's in Carlisle. However, they spent probably 3 years more than they would need to have in selling the store to hold on to it during a period when they really wanted to be out of it for health reasons, for the single purpose of not selling it until they contractually had somebody who would keep it a general store. And they did. And it is still open today. I like to joke that Larry is the only person in the chapter, Honey, I Bought the Store, who actually uttered those words verbatim, Honey, I Bought the Store. He corrected me the first time he came to one of my book talks, and he said, no, Ted, I didn't say to Robin, honey, I bought the store. I said, honey, we're going to buy the store. I said, really? All right. That is still an absurdly overconfident husband. I said, you're lucky, Robin, to say, honey, I hope you still have the receipt. Okay? But my favorite, honey, I bought the store, because it's just so incongruous, involves a bona fide Hollywood superstar, Steve Carell, right? Or otherwise, if you're a fan of The Office, known as America's Worst Boss. You know, when you imagine, if you imagine a husband and wife couple from New England, both from New England, right? Hardy New Englanders, who are the proud owners of a historic old New England general store. If you imagine that, this is probably not what you come up with, right? Right. And yet that's exactly what you're looking at. It's exactly what you're looking at. Steve Carell grew up in Acton, Massachusetts. And when I interviewed Steve for the book, now that I've talked to him on the phone, I call him Steve. When I interviewed him for the book, I asked him. The first question I asked him, I said, where does your interest in little old New England general stores come from, Mr. Hollywood? And he said that when he was growing up in Acton, there was a local little general store in Acton, unfortunately long gone, that was the first place he was allowed to go as a little kid on his bike with his allowance money and buy penny candy at the local general store. How many of you had the same experience? For how many of you was it the case that a small local store was the first place you were allowed to go by yourself? Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. I love that. I love asking. I love seeing all those hands come up. Me too. I grew up a little bit to the north and east of here. I grew up in Winthrop, Massachusetts, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L.
Right.
It was a noisy town. But it was the same thing. Little local store. I went on my bike. And the same was true of Steve's wife, Nancy. She grew up closer to here in some ways. She grew up in Cohasset on the South Shore. And summers, she would go next door to Marshfield Hills. In the Marshfield Hills General Store, how many of you have been there? How many of you have been there? I'm not surprised there's a few here. And with her big sister Tish, so they both had this interest and fond, recollections of general stores. About 15 years ago, Nancy's big sister Tish went out to Hollywood over Christmas time to visit her sister and her famous brother-in-law. And while she was there, she told Nancy that the general store in Marshfield Hill was up for sale. And Nancy said, who do you think is going to buy it? And she said, I don't know if anybody's going to buy it. It's been on the market for about 8 months, almost a year, and the last I heard, I read on the Globe coming out here, that some local developer is proposing turning it into condos. And with that, Steve went into the kitchen, having overheard this. They started talking, long story short. When Nancy's sister Tish returned that Christmas time to Boston, she had with her a check with which to purchase the Marshfield Hills General Store. And I wasn't kidding. It is an authentic, historic general store. During the Civil War, there were Union Army uniforms stitched here in the attic. It's one of the few general stores in New England today that still has, it was once the case that all of them had a working post office. Marshfield Hills still has a working post office attached to it. And I think that Steve and Nancy Carell and Tish and their design people, I think they did a great job of maintaining the historical integrity, right, of the general store. And Steve made his sister-in-law Tish general manager of the store. She manages it today. Today the Carells own a house in Cohasset. They're out here every summer. And today, no summer is complete without a confirmed Carell sighting at the store that he owns. And, we've talked so far about saving stores. We've talked about individual saving stores. But, as I put this talk together, I thought it was also important to pay some homage, if you will, to some general stores that have never needed saving. They deserve a little nod too, right? They haven't even needed saving. These are some general stores around New England that I call tried and true that are just that. They've never been up for sale. I don't think they ever will be up for sale. They are so ingrained in the fabric of these small towns that I don't think for most of these towns it's possible to even imagine life in these towns without their store. One of my favorites is in Warren, Vermont. The Warren store, anybody ever been there? Yeah, you ever had a sandwich from there? Yeah, you don't have to have dinner after you have a sandwich at the Warren store for lunch. It is the heart and soul of Warren, Vermont. As I said, like all these stores, it's been around for just over 200 years. Here it is in the 40s, but it's been around for hard-by and ski country, kind of in between Waitsfield and Warren. And it's the heart and soul of Warren. It really is. If you are anywhere within 20 miles or so of the Warren store, you are probably in there at least once or twice a week. I was last there 2.5 years ago. I know it was 2 years ago this past March, because it was a presidential election year. You may or may not want to recall, but it was a presidential election year, and it was primary season. And I was up there, and I stopped in to say hi to my friend Jack Garvin, who owns the store. I said, Jack, what's new? And he said, what's new, what's new? He said, oh, I'll tell you something that's new. He said, we're having a little fun right now. We are having a naming contest to name the wood stove. It gets pretty slow by February. But no, actually, it makes more sense at the Warren store than it might seem, because the wood stove at the Warren store, you'll find a wood stove in almost every single general store, but the one at the Warren store is ginormous. It is like the most visible element of the store when you walk in. So I said, well, have you had any good candidates for a name yet? And he said, funny you should use that word. So it turns out, about a week before I was in the store, another friend of the store, actually a pretty famous Vermonter in his own right, had dropped in. I'm surprised he dropped in because he was pretty busy at that time of his life and the year. He might have been back in Burlington doing laundry for all I know, but he dropped into the store. And he asked Jack the same question, you know, what's new? And Jack told him about the contest. And he obviously is quicker on his feet than I am. And he said, I have a suggestion. And they liked it. And he won. Is that perfect?
Yeah.
Right? And you know, I've always wondered, because you know, just about 3 months to the day that he won the stove naming contest, he lost his bid to get the Democratic presidential nomination. And I've always liked to think that maybe on some level, Bernie Sanders took some special solace in the fact that, unlike Hillary, he won the stove naming contest at the Warren store. It's not nothing. It's not nothing. But you know, my favorite chapter in some ways in the book, a second favorite, is that the one of a kind, because these stores represent the sort of crowning glory of a general store. Because they are like the combo platter of general stores. They're all, everything we've talked about, they're all of the above, right? They've never needed to be saved. I don't think they ever will need to be saved. They are ingrained in the fabric of their community. They are tried and true. And on top of that, they are so unique for some special reason that, well, they needed their own chapter. One of my favorites is Dan and Witt's. I'm going to be right up there next week, and I can't wait. It's in the Upper Valley of Vermont, but you know the Upper Valley stretches through Vermont at that point, the Connecticut River. Hanover, New Hampshire is right on the other side of Norwich, so it's that area of the Upper Valley. And Dan and Witt's were not the original owners of the store. They actually worked at the store in the 1930s while they were in high school. They were high school buddies. By the 1950s, they owned the store. And they did very well. They did very well. They were very confident. They put this sign in the window. Right? And they did well, and they wanted to expand. The problem was, they wanted to physically expand. The problem was, they had very little options, physically, for expansion. Right? They couldn't expand on this side because the Norwich Inn is here. They couldn't expand on this side because there's a street and a park. So the only place they could really expand was directly behind the store, where there was about 3/4 of an acre of vacant land. Witt did not like the idea, because he said, nobody's going to even see that we're bigger. What's the point? Dan said, every customer who comes in will find out we're bigger, and they'll tell people. Witt kind of groused, but they did. They expanded. So what makes Dan & Witts so unique is that you have an odd grafting job. You have a classic general store. You walk in, this is what you see from the front door, and it's cluttered, it's small. In fact, from where I'm standing to where that guy and his son, I assume, are at those refrigerators, is not even as far as the back wall. Not even as far as the back wall. Maybe, if that's the front door, this wall, maybe that's where they are. So it's not very big. It's not very big. But if you go just to the left of where those two guys are standing, there's a door. It doesn't have a sign. It doesn't even have a door. It's a doorway. And if you go through that, you're in the back. The back does not end where you, it just follow the roof, the ceiling, because it just keeps going back there. So really what you have at Dan & Witts, you have a little authentic New England general store, and you have a big box store grafted onto it. Right? Right? And you could get lost back there. And I'm a big enough man to admit that I did. First time I visited Dan & Witts, Dan Frazier, the original Dan's grandson, was showing me around. It was a late winter afternoon. He said, we're short-handed. I got to run back out front. You're welcome to walk around. I did. After about 10 minutes of wandering around and putzing around, I said, you know, I'm ready to go. Every aisle I went up did not leave me back. And you know, it's a little bit embarrassing. It's kind of like getting lost in a corn maze, right? Right, because if you can't find your way out of a corn maze, it sounds like you don't know where you are. You're still not getting out any faster, right? So finally, I found my way out, and I said to Dan, I said, I just got lost in the back. And he said, oh, don't worry about it, it happens all the time. I said, really? Oh, yeah, it happens all the time. So it turns out, at Dan & Witts, they have the commercial equivalent of the ski patrol. Let me explain. So if you ski, you know that at a ski area, at generally 4 or 4:30, depending on the time of year, when the lifts close to the public, they stop, you know, everybody else going up, but they close the lifts to the public, and then the ski patrol goes up. And they go down every single trail and every single slope, and they flush them all out to make sure that, God forbid, nobody's left behind or hurt or whatever after dark. So at 9 o'clock every night at Dan & Witts, they send someone out into the back. Flush out the back. And I said to Dan, I said, well, you don't find people back there, right? He said, oh yeah, all the time. I said, what are you talking about? He said, like once a week. We like find some 10-year-old kid wandering around. I said, that's terrible. He said, between you and me, you know what's really odd? Half the time we know for a fact their parents left like an hour ago. So my other favorite one of a kind is in Windsor, Maine, where Harlan Hussey, looks like Hussey, but Harlan Hussey was a German immigrant who, just like Dan & Witts, did very well. He had a little single-story, little garage-like general store at the intersection there of the two main roads in Windsor, Maine, and he did really well all through the 20s, 30s, 40s. By the 1950s, he too wanted to expand. And he too was very limited in how he could expand. He couldn't go on either side, he couldn't go out back, so he could go up and down. And that's what he did. So in the 1950s, 1957, he reopened Hussey's as a 3-story commercial colossus. There's a basement level, there's a ground level, there's a second floor. Now you can imagine there's a lot of stuff in 3 floors of a gigantic general store. So you might figure correctly that you need some sort of guidepost to guide you. And there is one. And when you walk in, you'll see that what makes Hussey's unique, as far as we know in all the world, they sell something in combination. Well, better to just see it. So start reading the sign from the bottom for maximum impact, right? So far, yeah, wood stoves, home and garden, plumbing, electrical paint, hardware, camping gear, fishing, hunting supplies, guns, bridal gowns, clothes. Whoa, what? What the? That's got to be a typo. No. So Hussey's in Little Windsor, Maine, is the only general store in the entire world that sells the combination of guns, gowns, and beer. That sign has been on Letterman. It's been a... Right. So basically what Huzzies really is, without even trying to admit that, is your one-stop shopping for a shotgun wedding. No, literally. No, literally. I'm not... Literally. Because here is Harlan Huzzi's granddaughter, Kristen, on her wedding day. Yeah, but it wasn't a real shotgun. But there she is. There's the lovely bride, posing with her bridal bouquet, a six-pack of Schlitz, and the groom is holding a brand new 12-gauge. All right, settle down. We're having too much fun. All right, so I want to kind of finish up and take you into, when you put together, I have found, you might find it differently, put a book talk together, but I have found that when you put a talk like this together, and over the last 5 years, I've spoken about 3 different books, it's better to sort of let it kind of, it's like a kid. Some kids are different than others, and people respond in different ways to different things they find interesting, so it's better to kind of keep it kind of fluid and change things and drop some things. And so this section wasn't part of the talk originally, a year ago, when I started talking about this book, but it became one of my favorite parts of the talk because of this. Every night, including tonight, I always ask if people have any questions. I love taking questions if people have questions. And what I found about a year ago is that every night somebody would ask me the same question. In fact, if somebody didn't ask me, although I don't think that ever happened, I'd be really surprised. And then they would the very next talk. And that was, if I have a favorite general store. Fair enough. That's a reasonable question. For a while I didn't think anything of it. And then as time went on, months, every single night somebody asked me if I have a favorite general store. Again, reasonable question. What really got me thinking, though, was that it was always the same story. That I responded with was always the same story. And, over time I didn't really have to think about it. So then I started thinking about why it was my favorite general store. And when I thought about that, I realized I should share that. I should share why it's my favorite general store. Because it goes to the heart. We started talking about community. It goes to the heart of what a community represents. It goes to the heart of why communities matter. It goes to the heart of what communities find important. It goes to the heart of what some communities, none more than this one, will do to save a sense of community. There is no community, I don't know about the whole country, but there's no community in New England that has valued its general store more than Putney. No community at all. A.M. Corser, one of just 13 general store owners over 200 years. Over 200 years, 1796, one of just 13. It has always occupied the same spot above Little Sackett's Brook in the middle of Putney, Vermont. Always occupied the same spot, except when it wasn't there. Sounds like a riddle? Well, there's actually, unfortunately, some good reasons why. So the first time it almost wasn't there, and it has always looked, you'll realize that it's always looked rather similar for all that period, until the period we're about to talk about. The first time it almost wasn't there was a terrible night in 2008, when some faulty wiring on the 3rd floor broke out and caused the fire to break out about 1 o'clock in the morning. Thank goodness for volunteer firefighters, because they only muster for a fire as fast as they can all muster. And they got there really quickly. They were able to, it looks bad, right? But they were nonetheless, look, they were able to salvage almost 2/3 of the building. And the Putney realized they were going to have to rebuild the store. Problem was, the owners had no insurance. And they took it as a total loss, and they took it as a good opportunity to up and leave Putney. So the town was left with what to do with now this hulk of a general store that they don't own, and the owners are gone. So the call went out to our good friend, remember Paul Brun? Right. Jumped in his beat-up Prius, drove down from Burlington, this time to Putney. He's like Batman in Vermont when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? So he got there and he met with Lisa Papazio of the local historical society. She explained the tale of woe, and he said, well, first thing I got to do is make you folks the owners of the store. We're going to make the town the owners of the store. I said, how are we going to do that? I said, don't worry, it's going to be a lot of paperwork, Lisa, but we're going to do it. And he got the paperwork rolling, and he worked with Bernie Sanders and so forth, and they found federal money, and state money, and matching grant. They got federal loans, and they raised a lot of money, and they were able to rebuild the Putney General Store, and all was gleaming and beautiful, and the heart and soul of little Putney, Vermont, population 967, was beating once again, and everybody rejoiced. But the rejoicing lasted only a year and a half. Less than 2 years later, November 1st, 2009, fire broke out in the store again. And let me tell you something. As bad as this looks, and as you can imagine, this is total loss. Okay? It was a 14-alarm fire. It couldn't do a damn thing. That was gone in less than 90 minutes. Burned down to the paving stones, the foundation stones, gone. As bad as it looks, it was worse. It was worse. Because this time, there was no faulty wiring. This time, investigators found traces of massive accelerant throughout the building, arson. So this time, the little tightly knit community of Putney, Vermont had to deal with the double gut punch that not only had they just lost the heart and soul of their community, but the person who did this horrible thing might be your neighbor. Who knows? And in Putney, that fall, late fall, early winter, it felt like a death in the family. And indeed it was, because that store was like extended family to the entire town. And the call went out once again to Paul Broom. Lisa Papazian called up Paul. He drove down through the night, and he arrived there about 6 a.m. He slept in his car for an hour. They met at 7 o'clock at the little church that stood across from where the store had stood. There was a lot of anguish, a lot of tears. He was pretty somber in his assessment. They said, Paul, is there anything we could do? He said, well, he had just gone off the phone, as a matter of fact, with Bernie Sanders. And he said, I'll tell you one bad thing. He said, I'm told that the federal loan money is still in the pipeline. We were expecting it at the end of this month, but the store was collateral on that loan. And now we have no collateral. I don't know what that means. So there was a lot of genuine anguish. After about half an hour, about 50, 75 more people showed up. After about an hour, there was about 100 people from the town that had heard about the meeting. They had to move the meeting out into the cold open air for space. And more anguish, more tears. Finally, an older gentleman whose family went back 5 generations in Putney stood up on the little stone wall that's right between the sidewalk and the street where the store was, and he said, I just have one thing to say. He said, I will be goddamn if an arsonist will define my town. And Paul Broom kind of let that sit in the air. And he stood up and he said, if I hear this gentleman correctly, we need to rebuild. And they did. And the one saving grace, the one silver lining from this horrible tragedy was that this was such awful news that it was front page news literally all over the world. In foreign newspapers, there was this picture. These 2 pictures. It led broadcast news all over America, and money poured into Putney. More money than they needed to rebuild the store. They were able to create an endowment for the store. They were able to rebuild the store. They were able to get donated labor from everything from the timber to a local sawyer to cut the wood. They were able to reopen the store. The store was bigger. The store was more secure. Now, they still needed somebody to run the store, right? Because the Historical Society now owned the store. The town owns the store, but they don't run it. They needed someone to actually manage and run the store. Luck was with them. They had this wonderful local pharmacist, okay, who had been an immigrant to Putney 15 years earlier, and he felt that the store had been this place of refuge for him and his children, his family, who did not even speak English, when they moved there, and he felt like the store was a place where they were accepted, and he said, I want to give something back. If I can run my pharmacy on the second floor, I will not take a dime from the profits. And they said, well, this sounds good, that way, to the second floor. And he did. And the store reopened, and everything was wonderful until January 1st last year,
Oh, no.
when this wonderful man died. Neither of his kids wanted to run the store, and the store closed again.
Oh.
However, this time Paul Brune got a jump on Putney, Vermont. He called up Lisa Papazian and he said, Lisa, I understand the store is closed. First, I'm sorry for your loss. Second, you got to reopen the store. How many people do you have now in the society? She said, 41 people. Good. He said, everybody puts an hour a week. Put in an hour a week, form a skeleton crew, open that store while you look for someone to run the store, because I'm going to tell you something right now, I know from painful experience. He told her, the longer that store stays closed, the longer it will be before it reopens. And they took his wisdom and they reopened the store. The store is open again. The store is thriving again. I was up there last fall, and as Paul Brune puts it so well, the Putney story is truly about perseverance. And as we finish, I do want to point something out, to be a little sober for a minute. You know, we've been talking about all these wonderful general stores that thrive and have been saved. There are still general stores that close all over New England. About 25 every single year close in New England. One of the most heartbreaking losses was 6 years ago, 2012 in Adamsville, Little Compton, Rhode Island, where Gray's closed. Gray's at that time had been the longest continuously operated general store in America, 224 years, which is only about 24 years less than the country had been in business. So that was a sobering loss. And you know, even a little more poignantly, the Monterey General Store. This is a page from my book. This is a page from my book. When the book went to the publisher 1 year ago, the Monterey General Store was open. Today, it's closed. So we're still losing general stores, and we would lose more general stores if it weren't for a new breed of general store owners. And I feel compelled, in closing, to sort of throw a little bit of thanks to some of these wonderful new general store owners. And here's what's surprising. Most of them, a lot of them, are not who you would think. A lot of them are younger than you would think. A lot of the new general store owners around New England are millennials, which I find fascinating. Sometimes under 30, around 30, just over 30. Of a generation that you might not think would have the same feeling for brick and mortar and close-knit community and dealing in person, face-to-face with folks as perhaps their parents or their grandparents' generation. And yet, some of them do. Some of them, wonderful people in Whitefield, Maine, like Ben and Taryn Marcus, who are the epitome of the wonderful new breed of general store owners. They had no interest in running a general store. I think they still find it hard to believe they run a general store. They're farmers. They're farmers. They met at agriculture school in Washington State. When they graduated, Ben's family was from Whitefield. They moved back, and their hope was to be able to afford some land to farm in that area. Land in that area is not cheap. And they were unable to find something. And finally, one day, a local guy came up to him and he said, listen, I know you guys are looking for some farmland. He said, I'm going to make you a crazy offer. He said, I will give you 5 acres of prime farmland. They said, what's the catch? He said, oh, catch. He said, the catch is, there is a long-closed, defunct general store on that property. Sheepscot General, it's been closed for over 30 years. If you reopen that store and can keep it open for 2 years, the land is yours forever. They still deliberated. That's how much they did not want to run a store. So then they came upon a plan. They said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll only buy stuff for the store that we like, especially food. We'll only buy food for the store we like to eat. No, because their thought was when this whole thing goes south, we can personally liquidate the inventory. Right? They thought we won't have to go food shopping for a year and a half. Right? So that didn't happen. Oh, the land produced all right. Incredible organic produce. Incredible organic produce that people would line up for at the end of the day to buy from the store, and that was kind of the store, right? They were selling their produce. After about 6 months, they said to each other, you know what? People like our produce, but one of us still has to drive hundreds of miles every week all around southern New England to hit the farmers markets, which is what you have to do as a farmer today in New England. They said, what if we found somebody to maybe cook with our produce, open like a little cafe at the store? What about that? They did find a wonderful person to run a little cafe at the store with their produce. Now cars were lining up in the morning too. And they started adding all kinds of other things. Now I'm going to tell you something. If you're a general store purist, right, and you think that, well, general stores should sell this and this, well, I got news for you. No general store in New England still sells, for the most part, still sells hardware. There's no general store in New England anywhere, and hasn't for 50 years, that sells, for instance, an anvil. What? All of them used to. You know what people want now at a general store? Some basics, and they want a place to tarry with a neighbor. They want coffee, a good sandwich. That's what the new breed of general stores realize. And you know what? General store owners have a lot in common with one of my other loves, public libraries. You know why? Because as Libby Fox will tell you, public libraries today, the good ones, they know. It's like the dirty little secret. It's not just about books anymore. Am I right? It isn't enough to simply say, oh, come here and get a book. That's not enough. Unfortunately, it's not enough. People have all kinds of other ways of getting books. You don't have to trudge down to the public library and get a library card and get a book. That's great, but you don't have to do that. But you know what you can't do on Amazon? You can't run into your neighbor. So libraries realize they need to offer all kinds of added services, value added. Programs like this one, right? They need to, and they do. The good libraries realize that, so does the new breed of general store owners. So it's true, if you were last in Sheepscot General Store in 1918, then you probably would wonder, the hell's a wine tasting doing here? You would wonder, what is an open mic? In fact, what's a mic? Right? But they've realized this. In fact, they've also started yoga classes, childcare classes, CPR classes. They've opened the only lending library in Whitefield, Maine for 40 miles, right? And that's what has made Sheepscot General thriving today and popular with families and with young people and older people, and it's why it gives me hope. And what could give you more hope than the reopening of Hope General in 2016, Hope General Store in Hope, Maine, that because of this new breed of general store owners that get it, that there will be a future for general stores around New England, and that is New England's general stores. Thank you. So true to my word, I'm happy to take a question or two. If anybody hasn't, but now you don't have to ask me what's my favorite general store. Because you wouldn't want me to run through that again. Yes, ma'am.
Would you ever consider buying a general store?
Are you selling one? You know, it's very funny. I did a talk in Falmouth last November. Exact same question. Oh, but wait. So I said the same thing. Are you selling a general store, smart ass that I am? And she said, as a matter of fact, I am. True story. So yeah, I was kind of put on the spot. So I bought it. But you know what? I'm not smart enough to run a general store. The store would go out of business in 6 months. I'm not smart enough. If you buy any books tonight, you'll find out that I really mathematically challenged. So don't worry, I'll make sure you get the right change. But no, I think that it would be. You know what I would do before I? Believe me, I would love to support, and I do support general stores in any way I can. When I retire, I would consider running a diner. I would consider running a diner.
There's one for
Of
sale.
course, I'll also run a diner into the ground, but, you know.
There's one for sale in South Middleborough.
Yeah.
Very old one.
Very old.
Really?
Yeah.
It's for sale.
How is it? I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
Is it still open?
No.
Oh. How long has it been closed?
Maybe 6 months.
Oh, maybe 6 months, not that long?
Well,
Yeah, it was closed.
It was closed for years.
It
Oh,
was
it's
open
closed
for years, closed for years, reopened, everybody's all
I
I
excited.
don't know what happened.
It's in real railroads were not.
It is, huh? Is it a Worcester? Is it a Worcester then? Do you know if it's
Probably used to know.
No.
It's a train, it's a train.
Well, that's good to know. I will check that out. Not for buying it, but just because I'm curious. That's good
They
to know.
spent a lot of money running
It's
it.
a train,
It's a train car.
It's an actual
It's a real
car, yeah,
train.
yeah. Well, that's how they started. You know, the very first diner in Worcester, or some say Woonsocket, but was exactly that. The reason diners started was when work shifts went to 24 hours. So people were getting out of work, you know, at 2 in the morning, and nothing was open to eat. So they finally just, you know, made one railroad car, you know, served some food out of it, but then they couldn't tie up space on the tracks, so they moved it off the tracks. Birth of the diner. Now you know. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Does the store have to have a community meeting place, not formally, but like chairs or something, to qualify as a general store?
No, no. What it has to do, so that's the other, I don't know, I think I said that, one of the metrics for the stores we included in this book is that they have to be a community gathering place. But by that doesn't mean that they're having any formal meetings. It means that it's a place that people actually tarry. They don't just run in. So, as you well know, right, there's plenty of places you may drive by on the road, you may know a place, you may go into a place, and it may call itself a country store or a general store, but it's not a community gathering place, right? It's a place that you might run in and get something quick, but you're not going to hang out a while, right? And so that's what distinguishes a true general store. It's a place where people gather. I don't mean they necessarily meet, although you could. I know that there are general stores where people do meet. Have meetings, but they don't have to, but they do have to be a place that people gather. Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes.
The old joke is that you cannot buy anything specific at a general store.
You cannot buy anything specific at a general store because it doesn't work if you substitute country store, which is what many of them are called, right? Those are interchangeable. Those are interchangeable, but that's a good old chestnut of general stores. Anyone else? So, listen, again, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Thank you to the Friends of the Middleborough Public Library. I do have copies of all of my books here tonight, including Wicked Pissed, which was my last book about New England's most famous feuds, and my first book, which I have not spoken about here yet, hint, hint. This is my only hardcover, and it is, it's kind of a favorite. It's a collection of my favorite people from around New England. People and places from around New England. So I do have copies here tonight. If anybody would like to purchase a book, I would be honored to sign one for you, no extra charge. Whether you buy a book or not, I have a sign-up list right here for my newsletter. I am at work on another book, or hope to be very soon. So if you'd like to get on my newsletter list where I kind of keep people kind of posted on what's going on, if you give me your email address, I would be more than happy to put you on the list and keep you posted. And if you do give me your email address and get on the list, there is a 50-50 shot you'll never hear from me again. I feel honor-bound to say that because I'm not very good. See, how good would I be running a store? Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.